USS Constellation. There's a grand lady in Baltimore who has taken her rightful place as the Inner Harbor's crown jewel in the heart of the Chesapeake Bay. Launched in 1854 as the last all-sail ship designed and built for the United States Navy, Constellation's century of service embraced the ages of sail, steam, gas, diesel, and nuclear power. Imagine that, launched in 1854 and still afloat. Even more exciting, visitors can come aboard Constellation and explore to their heart's content. On board Constellation, history comes alive as visitors touch, feel, and experience what life was like for sailors during the Civil War. Just bring your imagination.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Quinn Yarbro, and I'm very pleased to be a guest.
How did you get started?
As a writer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the easiest thing to do is just say I started writing. I think that's the way anybody who does this really does it. You know, you just start to write, and I did that when I was 4. And I've been doing it ever since. It's something that, you know, so far as I'm concerned, I was hardwired for it. And I do think that for most people who do fiction, you are hardwired for it. And if you aren't, the chances are that you will find doing it too arduous and too depleting than if you are. I mean, it's arduous and depleting whether you're wired for it or not. The question is the degree to which it is.
Mm-hmm. So, like, as a 4-year-old, that's pretty tough order for a 4-year-old, you know. As a 4-year-old, though, you're saying that some people are predisposed to it, the energy of creating. Like, is it the creativity, or are these kids, would these be kids that are very creative and imaginative as to...
I would imagine. I mean, I also think that at least most of the writers I know were aware that they wanted to write when they were quite young. I mean, I know a couple of exceptions, but the vast majority of them, you know, were telling stories and writing stories when they were in grade school. And which tends to suggest to me that that means that they have an inclination and an ability that they recognize very early in life. I mean, prodigies in writing are very, very rare. They're far more common in music. But part of it is because, you know, you need to get some experience in order to write, and you need to build a vocabulary in order to write, and you need to spend a certain amount of time just learning what good writing is before you actually try to do it.
So you have a good background in music as well, you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel as a child, was there the propensity towards music or writing, or just like together, or one after the other?
They're sort of like two sides of the same coin. You know, music is what you do when you run out of words. And storytelling is what you do when the melodies aren't there.
Mm-hmm.
And I like doing them both. I'm a fairly rapid writer, but I'm a very slow composer.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you feel that, I'm just going to ask it,
right.
Don't be insulted, but did you ever feel you were hearing any voices encouraging you as a child in this area?
No.
Okay. Well,
I heard there were some that weren't very happy about what I was writing, but that's okay. Most of what I like to write about distressed my mother very much.
Now, was that because of the occult nature?
Well, she wasn't, that didn't, she just found that weird, but a lot of what I write about deals with some very dark things psychologically, and often with violence, and it just, you know, she didn't like that at all, and was pretty vocal about it.
Well, thank God she didn't put you on Ritalin or something.
Well, you know, at my age, we didn't have Ritalin.
Right. I know, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
When do you feel you really wrote your first piece and you really, you know, began as a professional writer, say?
Well, I originally did script writing for a children's theater company, and some of those were performed, and that ended awkwardly, so I switched over to prose, and I sold my first story when I was 26, and that's 44 years ago now, and I've been doing it ever since. My first experience with a publisher was when I sold a story that they retitled as Postures of Prophecy, that I called Misconception, to If magazine. And I was 26, and I got paid $20 for it, and you know, but that was the dividing line between amateur and professional. And there's nothing quite like that first sale, because that's the one that proves that you really knew what you were doing all along.
When did you decide you needed an agent? How did that all come about?
Well, realistically, if you're only selling short stories, unless you're selling to things like, Playboy or Atlantic Monthly or the New Yorker, you don't need an agent. And a lot of agents don't particularly like short stories to handle, because agents have the problem they want to be making money, and they make it a percentage of what you make, and if you're getting paid 3 cents a word, that isn't going to be a very big percentage, even for a long story for an agent. So it was a matter of going through to get enough publishing done, and then to start doing novels, which is what I'd wanted to do all along anyway. But this way I had a track record. I was not a pig in a poke. And I could say, take a look at what I've done before. And if you've got questions about my capacity to do it or to finish it, don't hesitate to say no, because I don't want you to buy anything you don't love. And I got an agent through a friend of mine, the late Gordon Dixon, who was a hell of a nice guy. And he said, there's this guy who's just moved to New York. He needs clients. You're working on a novel. Let him have a crack at it, which is how I got my first agent. And I was with him for almost 10 years.
Now, what was your first novel that you did?
The first novel I sold, which is different than the first novel that I did, was called Ogilvy, Talent and Moon. And it's about a law firm in San Francisco. And one of the lawyers is... he's an Ojibwe and is a traditional shaman on the side. And it makes an interesting juxtaposition, the strictures of law versus shamanistic experiences. And there are 4 Charlie Moon books, and I tried very hard to make sure that I balanced those 2 factors as much as possible in the stories. I don't know how well I did, because no writer really ever knows how well they do anything.
So with Charlie Moon, then, that was a character that you developed through 4 novels. Is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm.
Yes. As I say, an attorney working in San Francisco, and he was Ojibwe, and had been his father had come to America during World War II, and he had come with his father, which is how he ended up not being in Canada.
Now, are these 4 books available? No?
Sort of. They were reprinted by Ramble House, which is a small press venture in the South, and so far as I know, they're still available, but they have not been selling like mad, and I'm trying to find an e-publisher for them.
So that was the first, Charlie Moon was the first.
Ogilvy, Talent and Moon being the name of the partnership that he's part of.
Okay. And then what would you say was your next, success?
Well, you have to be careful how you define success. The next sale, which was actually just 6 weeks after I sold Ogilvy, Talent and Moon, or rather Kirby sold Ogilvy, Talent and Moon, and that was Time of the Fourth Horseman, which is science fiction, and a little closer to what I normally tend to do. Then Hotel Transylvania sold, and shortly after that I sold another Charlie Moon, and shortly after that I sold False Dawn, and so it began to work out that I was developing the schedule I was going to be keeping. I didn't know for years and years and years, which is 3 to 4 books a year.
Wonderful. Now, this is, you're not defining that as success, but obviously at that time, if one after another is selling, you're feeling successful about it.
Well, they aren't selling for huge bucks. I mean, mid-list writers don't get paid a hell of a lot. And as I've said for, decades now, if they paid me more, I'd write less.
Yeah, that's true.
Yep.
Yeah, and then you spoil the joy. They don't pay me anything, so I write a whole lot. Okay. But anyway, getting back to Hotel Transylvania, now you just got a wonderful notoriety on that.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Or you want to tell us about that?
Well, the Horror Writers Association is doing a one-time award for the best vampire novel of the last century. And they have a list of 6, and I'm on it. It's a great honor, actually, to be nominated. I know people say that, and they're sort of glib about it, but it really is. I mean, it's a distinction that is going to follow whoever gets it, with tremendous importance in the way their work is viewed, and that's always lovely. And the Bram Stoker Awards, which are given by the Horror Writers Association, are very, very, very important in the horror field, in the horror genre, and they are gradually gaining a lot of foothold in the reading public's understanding too. But awards like that take a long time before they actually become something that the reading public understands. And I remember watching an episode many years ago of Murder, She Wrote, which I thought was a lot of fun. It had nothing to do with writing books, but it was a lot of fun. And Jessica had, 2 Edgars sitting on her mantle, which are these little bisque heads of Edgar Allan Poe. And someone was saying, those are really kind of shoddy looking. I said, no, those are real Edgars. That's what they look like. Mm-hmm. And, it's important if you want them to get them, And yeah, it was one of those elements that I found was really nice, that they actually bothered to get a proper Edgar. And
I see what you're saying.
yeah,
for the show to actually care enough to get it right.
Get the real
right.
to get the real award.
Let me stop. Right. So let's talk. Let's tell them about Saint-Germain. Okay.
Well, he showed up in Paris in 1743 and was seen to be someone of tremendous wealth, and he was known to be an alchemist and interested in occult studies. Exactly how much he actually did as compared to what he is supposed to have done is almost impossible to tell. But he spent the next 40 years wandering about the major royal courts of Europe, and was seen several times after his supposed deaths, and there are 2 of them reported, so which is a neat trick. And eventually, in the early part of the 1800s, he was seen in Genoa by someone who had actually known him in Paris, and he said he was on his way to Egypt, and that was the last time somebody who had actually known him saw him. He was in Genoa, and he was on his way, he said, to Egypt, and I think it was 1802, and he nobody who had ever known him in Europe saw him after that. My own guess is that he probably died there sometime in the next 4 to 5 years would be my guess, because he was even though he didn't look terribly old, he would have been of, considerably advanced age.
So you actually think he's dead?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Absolutely. Do I think he was 4,000 years old? No, I think he was lying in his teeth. But it's a good story, and I'm not about to say no to a good story just because I think he was fibbing.
Oh, I believed it. Okay, so Saint-Germain. But that was, I mean, as we've talked before, there was recording that he existed through at least 2 centuries. Recorded documents.
Right. Well, and he himself, I mean, whether he actually wrote or somebody wrote for him Le Trinosophie, we have a record of what it was he was apparently, involved in terms of the occult. But there is, he did hang out with all the major occult groups of the period, and did a lot of work for various royal courts, which may or may not have involved spying. And we know that he spoke certainly 15 and maybe 20 languages.
And also it was recorded that, I've heard that nobody ever actually saw him eat.
Yeah, he wore black and white at a time that was rare, unless you were in the clergy. And he would not eat or drink in public. He said he kept his youth by drinking the elixir of life, which opened a big door for me. And he was, he claimed to have had all kinds of interesting encounters in the past, meaning the very distant past. And I just took him at his word and extrapolated from there.
Okay, now your Saint-Germain was out before Forever Night, right?
Oh, yeah.
Your character, okay. And so nobody came to you about the idea for a great idea for a television series, huh?
Nope.
So now you have, 23 Saint-Germain novels?
Mm-hmm. You've asked about the possibility of film or TV versions of it. I would love to have film or TV versions of it for any number of reasons. I mean, I've got a very large stack of material to draw on, for one thing, and for another, it would give the books a lease on life they haven't had. And, of course, the money isn't bad either. So, there was an independent producer who had the rights to the books for several years, but it came to nothing, as these things generally do. And as I say, I'd be delighted to put it in the hands of someone who actually wasn't trying to do something cutesy-poo.
Anything you need to set the record straight on or write about?
Well, I think one of the things that occasionally is a little off-putting is that I don't just do vampires. I mean, I don't just do horror. I do mysteries, I do fantasy, I do kids' books, I do westerns. I love westerns. And but they are the sort of things that, yes, I understand that everybody lives in the shadow of Saint-Germain, me included, but it would be lovely to have an opportunity for some of these others to get some time in the sun.
So you would like people to know more about your western. Could you want to name some of the books?
There are 2 of them, and they were originally conceived as a series. And my editor, who was a lovely, lovely guy and one of my best friends in the business, changed houses and didn't take the westerns with him, and so there are only 2 called The Law and Charity, Colorado. And it's to me, what's interesting about the Wild West is that almost nobody was born there. Almost everybody who was in the Wild West came there. And in terms of how you develop a society, that's a very peculiar set of circumstances. And so, just as it were, the culture shock of it all. Never mind the 6 guns or anything like that. The social realities are the parts that fascinate me.
You said the 2 Western novels. Do you want to say a little bit about the messages from Michael now?
Well, those aren't novels, of course. Those are transcripts and commentary. There's a channeling group called the Michael Group that I've been involved with for 35 years now, and it's it's one of those things where those books came into existence because the editor that I'd been working with on another project had, when we were having lunch in New York one day, she said, One of my other authors told me that he thought I ought to be a Mississippi riverboat gambler, and this is, a nice Jewish girl from Queens, and so I said, well, would you like me to find out? And so she said, can you? I said, well, yeah, I'm in a group, and we've got a medium, and I can find out for you. And so when I got home and went to a session, we got the overleaves, which is a basic part of the teaching, and some comments on that life. And when I saw her again at a convention about a month later, I passed all it on to her, and she said, how much of this stuff is there? I said, 4 or 5 binders full of material. And she said, could you get a book out of it? And I said, well, I could, but I'm not sure the group would be amenable, or that, in fact, the medium would be amenable. We had a meeting about it, and the group said, so long as they were all disguised and no one could actually trace them, they would be willing. But I had an obligation not to reveal who anybody really was. And I said, fine. And so I invented, essentially composite personalities for all the, people involved, and then, took the material and took out anything that was going to be enough to identify anyone, and otherwise organized it, and then included the response and the attitude of group members toward the material. And there are 4 books, and there's been a 25th anniversary edition with additional information in it for the first 2, which is Messages from Michael and More Messages from Michael. I know there are other things out there that say it's Michael, but the only ones I vouch for are the ones I've written. Okay?
What other books would you like to talk about?
Well, I have a couple of my standalones I really like, and one of them is a double fantasy called Ariosto, which was nominated for a World Fantasy Award, and I'm also very fond of my first ebook, which was only available as an ebook, called Magnificat, which some of my Catholic friends aren't very fond of, but it was a lot of fun to write, and continues to sell 10 years later, so that's always good. And I'm also the young adult books that I've done. They've been interesting, and especially the historical ones, because I've often been shocked by how badly history is taught to kids, and so in doing things set in history in a way that is like real life rather than something that happens between dates, to me seemed to be an important way to tell a story.
Yeah, I noticed, because you really, really research everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So tell us about the research process.
Well, for one thing, I like to do research. I enjoy it. And I've learned that there's a certain order in which doing it seems to make sense, which is the first thing, is how do they see themselves and what do they believe? And then once you have your frame of reference, then take a look at the culture. And after the culture, take a look at the other cultures with whom they interacted, if any, and go on from there to form, a background that can function as a tertiary character, and then come up with people who can live believably in that society.
Now, were you involved with Berkeley? You said, I believe, that you were involved with Berkeley at one time.
Well, I grew up in Berkeley.
Yeah, so you want to
tell us...
And
I lived in Berkeley for a long time.
So tell us about the flavor back then. We were talking about that a little bit earlier, what the times were like.
Well, they vary. I mean, Berkeley changes. It's a very fluid kind of town. But basically, underneath everything, it really is a very, very big, very stodgy college town. And the heavy industry in Berkeley is education. And it shows in the way it's a company town. It can't help it be. And growing up being in school through the 50s, which were no fun in Berkeley, believe me. I mean, that's the time of the HUAC and McCarthy and all that, and bad things happened to a lot of very, very good and very well-intentioned people because of it. And So by the time the 60s came along, it was sort of, the social equivalent of for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And so the fact that Berkeley became very, very active politically, going to the extreme away from the experiences of the 50s, is hardly surprising. I like Berkeley. It's nuts, I agree. I mean, as only a native can. And but on the other hand, it's also it's never dull and it's never boring, and it's the sort of place that that you can get some anything you want to know about. Somebody there knows about it, and they know about it in an authoritative way, and you can make the most of what they know. I mean, I love to pick the brains of people over lunch, and that's easy to do in Berkeley.
I'm nuts about downtown Baltimore's West Side. Hello, I'm John Waters, and I'm proud to say that Baltimore has always been my home. It's the inspiration behind all my films, including Hairspray, Crybaby, Serial Mom, and A Dirty Shame. Let me tell you, there are not a more eccentric, monumental, eclectic, intriguing, and character-filled 28 blocks anywhere in the world, and I'm here to prove it to you. This is where Babe Ruth was born. They tell me he's the best baseball player ever. Not that I'd know. I'm more into theater. Like nearby Arena Players, the nation's longest continuously running African-American community theater. I'm also a big fan of Century-Old Antique Row, where New York dealers come to buy and later mark up their purchases sky high for their Manhattan buyers. On that same block sits the U.B. Blake National Jazz Institute, housing memorabilia from Baltimore jazz greats like Billie Holiday and, of course, UB himself. The West Side is also where the Maryland Historical Society calls home, with its many Baltimore artifacts, including the original manuscript of the Star-Spangled Banner and Nipper, the RCA dog. Oh, and the National Dentistry Museum, the only one of its kind in the U.S., is where George Washington's dentures live. And no, they were never wooden. And right in the middle of it all, as if just to add mystery and intrigue, sits the gravesite of Edgar Allan Poe, my kind of guy. Sometimes I go there to meditate. Now, the thing that defines Baltimore for many people around the world is right here also. Our sports franchises, the Orioles and the Ravens, two birds that nest in the West. The Walters Art Museum is also known internationally, featuring an interactive experience exploring 55 centuries of art. I'm nuts about downtown Baltimore's West Side. You will be, too.
Okay, now, do you feel that you've had any struggles as a woman in this industry?
Of course.
Well, I mean, do you want to share with us? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, sure. It's one of those things where, for one thing, to get taken seriously is very, very difficult. And you really have to be willing to put up with an awful lot of indifference from your male colleagues before you can actually start, being acknowledged as having value beyond, someone to talk to at dinner, and establishing, as it were, recognizable credentials is still difficult. It's not as bad as it was when I got into it, but on the other hand, the publishing market is in such disarray now that it hardly matters. I mean, everybody is kind of in free fall. And from all that I've encountered and seen, I mean, there is a tendency now to sort of shunt the young female writers off into the area of being derivative writers. They write something like something that other people have already proven is okay, which I find it's bad for a young writer to do that in the first place. It's bad for developing your own voice, and that's what the first few years of writing is all about. And it's unfortunate because then you get tagged with a label of something that isn't your own. And I feel that that doesn't do a service to any of the newer women in any field. But at the same time, with publishing acting like their hair is on fire, it's hardly surprising that there's this kind of pressure. They only want to bet on sure things, and there are no sure things when you're dealing with writing. There really aren't. And so there's one of those 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, or in this case, one of them sideways, is still very much in effect. And I'm often troubled to hear women writers have a tendency to disparage their own work as a way to avoid running into some of the criticism that's leveled on a sexist basis rather than just on the literary basis. But my feeling is, don't do their job for them. I mean, don't be an obnoxious person about it, but don't let that label stick to you if you can possibly avoid it, so that you have as much opportunity to move into different expressions of what you want to do. It's very important to leave yourself as many routes as you can.
Who were some of the women that might have inspired you, if there were any writing before,
Well, of course, Mary Shelley has a lot to answer for, and good for her. It's sort of scary to think that Frankenstein was written by a teenage girl, but it was, and I liked C.L. Moore's work very, very much, and I think that her ability to tell a certain kind of science fiction story that is high adventure was truly amazing. Because I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy when I was a kid, still do when I have the opportunity, and I think it's really important, if you're going to be a writer and you're going to do a lot of reading, is don't be selective. Be as eclectic as you possibly can and read as many things by as many people with as many points of view as you can, manage to get into your brain, and just stay with it, because otherwise you're going to lock into a mindset that's not going to help you.
You're not going to express yourself. You're going to be regurgitating.
Well, that, or you're just going to get used to thinking about things as a particular way. I mean, even with these, I mean, they may be the bulk of my reputation, but I like to do at least one other book between each one of these, just because I don't want to be doing the same thing over and over again. Thank you very much. Because eventually, no matter how much you love a character or hate a character, you will get stale.
What is the difference? Can you describe the difference between, say, Saint-Germain and the occult novels and what you're calling fantasy?
Well,
and say science fiction,
well, science fiction, is generally speaking expected to be based on, known science, and fantasy deals with the largely with the impossible made probable, and science fiction is the improbable that's being made possible. And those are two different mindsets in and of itself. And I tend not to be very fond of high fantasy, even though I've written some myself, because I find that they tend to be thin on a sense of reality. And that may be an odd comment to make about fantasy, but if you're going to introduce me to a world that you've invented, I mean, for one thing, it's got to have an economic system. I'm sorry, it just does. Whether it's based on cowrie shells or money or hours of labor, I don't care, but it's got to be there. And that's one of the things that many fantasy novels lack.
Okay, now what would you say, and so Saint-Germain's novels are more occultist, that's another genre?
Well, no, what they are is, and I've said this from the very beginning, from Hotel Trans on down, they're called historical horror novels, because history is pretty damn horrifying.
Tell me. So they're not really considered Gothic then, right? What's the difference between them and, say, Gothic novels?
Well, Gothic novels at the moment are out of fashion. And that's, fashion is part of it. But, of course, for one thing, they aren't confined to, as it were, the Gothic venues. I mean, it isn't anything like what the 19th century did in the way of Gothic things, and it certainly isn't the way that Gothic novels were presented from the 40s to the 60s. Discussing the history of vampires, I mean, it's one of the oldest archetypes in human culture, and it goes back. The first recognizable vampire that shows up in wall paintings in India was 35,000 years old, and there isn't a culture that we've come across, current or in the past, that didn't have a vampire myth. The two things that we seem never to be able to get rid of are the vampires and the weird creatures. Other than that, it's pretty flexible. But one of the nice things about vampires as a writer is that you can say vampire and you don't have to explain it to anybody because every culture has one. And the rules are fairly uniform. I mean, there are a couple rather odd vampires. There's a Chinese vampire, for example, that lives not on blood but on spinal fluid. And there's an Indian and Thai vampire that runs around with only its a head with a spinal column attached. And that's sort of minimalist, but it's still a recognizable vampire. It's an improperly dead thing that lives on the life energy and vitality of the living, usually in the form of blood, but not always. Okay.
Do you want to talk about Polidori or Lord Byron or any of those guys?
Well, of course, the 19th century was the great flowering of this kind of arcane literature. I mean, it became something that was literary rather than folkloric. And there's some very, very wonderful stories, not just the big ones like Dracula and the Vampire by Polidori and all that. There are some wonderful things such as by Wilkie Collins and Sheridan Le Fanu that are also very important and highly contributory to what happened in vampire literature by the time we got to the 20th century. But there's a kind of gap that occurs where the superstition around vampires fades, but the literary reincarnation has not happened yet, and so you get a period of about 150 years in Western literature where this kind of storytelling just doesn't exist in any form that is recognizable except in Russia, which of course in some weird way seems appropriate.
Okay, now do you want to talk a little bit about Bram Stoker?
Stoker, of course, writing was not his day job. His day job was running the Lyceum Theater for Sir Henry Irving, with whom he worked all of Irving's life, and then beyond that he took care of the theater. And he traveled widely with the theater troupe. I mean, they came to America a couple of times. There's some interesting letters from Stoker about Theodore Roosevelt, whom he admired greatly. And so you've got someone who is in a very successful but not quite mainstream social position as Stoker was. And he was able to take a look at the way that vampires and such were usually being written about, which is usually something far away, very, very different, that, an occasional hapless English person would stumble upon by accident while they were traveling abroad. The idea of bringing it home and, plunking it into your backyard, as it were, was what made the book so shocking and such a success. Because it was taking something that was seen as other, and saying it may be other, but it's right here. And a lot of the descriptions, for example, of Dracula are very similar to the descriptions of Henry Irving playing Mephistopheles in Faust.
That I noticed too.
Yep.
What about Mary Bathory? You want to talk about her a little tiny
Elizabeth
bit?
Bathory.
I mean, sorry, Elizabeth Bathory. Okay. Good.
Yes, Elizabeth Bathory is one of those characters she exists in her very, very own niche. There aren't very many like her. And but her belief that she could keep herself young and beautiful by bathing in the blood of young women certainly caused a stir in Hungary when she was there. And of course, Castle Bathory is out in the middle of nowhere, and if you're there by yourself, except for the servants, year in and year out, and you have, your personal servant is into not really witchcraft, but into magical things, and says this is the way you're going to be able to survive, and still be desirable when your husband finally gets home. You get this very, very odd hothouse situation. The reinforcement of the illusion and the reinforcement of what is obviously some sort of serious mental aberration, and but she certainly made herself unpopular in the region by, having peasant girls kidnapped and brought to her to be drained for blood. But that, in a weird way, really isn't a true vampire. I mean, she wasn't living on the blood; she was using it to keep herself young. Now, there may be a fine line there, but she really isn't quite that. And of course, the other thing is she's real; she really existed. And of course, when they found out what she'd been doing, they walled her up in a room, and she died.
And then, so that, between that and Vlad the Impaler.
Well, you see, the association between Stoker and Vlad is something that was invented by Florescu and McNally. It is not in anything that we know about any of the research that Stoker did. Did he ever run across anything more than one paragraph on, this guy named Dracula, who was a fierce opponent of the Turks? And that's about all it said. Now, I know what happened, because I'm a writer, and I know about these things, which is Stoker saw this wonderful name, and he saw the name of this wonderful place called Transylvania, which no one had really heard of, and many people even now don't think is real. Mm-hmm. And I've been there. It really is there. So, he took one look and said, oh, yummy, here's this name, which is far better than the one he'd been playing with for the 6 years he was preparing to write the novel, which was Count Vampire, and that doesn't do anything exciting, does it? But he loved the name. Just it was this terrific thing that he found, and said, now I've got something. And one of the first things he did was he got rid of the creepy servant, and left Dracula there all by his lonesome in his isolated castle. And in that, it was very unlike other kinds of stories about, weird guys living in castles. They always have, one really creepy servant. And, but Stoker, you'll find when you read Stoker that there isn't a creepy servant. I mean, they often stick one in cinematic forms.
But not in the real book.
Right, but not in the book. And when you look at the way that Stoker paced the book, which is largely through letters and journal entries, he gets to a point where what you're really seeing is a bunch of other people's impressions of someone who never actually speaks for himself. Dracula never tells you in Dracula what it is he thinks is going on. You know what everybody else thinks is going on. And when Fred Saberhagen wrote his wonderful The Dracula tapes, which is Dracula from Dracula's point of view, and very funny, by the way, it fills in a lot of the wonderful inconsistencies that exist in the book. And by which I mean Dracula. I mean, and of course, Saint-Germain is, I think of Saint-Germain as one of Dracula's stepchildren, because I took the Dracula model and pushed it as far to the positive as I could.
Because he's almost like a hero.
Nothing almost, of course he is.
He is, well, yeah. By our standards.
Yeah. Gilles de Retz, who was actually a military hero in France, and one of the marshals working under Joan of Arc, and he was accused of kidnapping and sexually abusing and killing and blood draining and all this other stuff young boys. Now, he probably did like young boys, but the people bringing the complaint against him were his wife and mother-in-law, both of whom hated him. Now, the argument is, well, that's because he really was doing these awful things, but the only time that he actually agreed was when he was under torture, which I consider to be, not a legitimate statement of behavior. And he was burned at the stake, and he's been assessed several times historically as, being probably schizophrenic. Now, it's very easy to do psychiatric evaluation on someone who isn't there to defend themselves, and I think it's also probably a little foolish to try to use later techniques on people who were in a society that didn't have that frame of reference. But I find myself, I'm not saying I would like de Retz, because I'm pretty sure I wouldn't, but I wouldn't like any major French marshal of the period. But I think that he's been done a very, very good trashing, and I don't think the real man was anywhere near as extreme as he was described, because the terms in which he is described as being extreme fit the rules of what it is that the inquisitors used to look for. And if you can be shoved into that pigeonhole perfectly, it usually means they put you there by shaping you that way.
But he was like the beginning of the werewolf.
Oh, no. Werewolves are much, much older.
Okay, but he did get some notoriety on that, though, because they said that he was a werewolf.
Well, no, they said that in the 19th century. They didn't say that in the 15th century.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, newer books. Okay.
Well, all of them. There's nothing new about it. In doing one of the things that was part of my original intention with the Saint-Germain books, and still is that they are stories about women, the lives of women, because that's one of the things that history, as we all know, is a little scant on, and what it was like for women to live in various times of history, and what the constraints and the conditions were, and how they coped. And almost all of the women with whom Saint-Germain interacts are, in one way or another, bucking the system. And then, of course, there's the Olivia books, and Olivia first appears in Blood Games, and she's a Roman matron, meaning first-century Roman matron, and she's used to the idea that she has legal rights and that she has position, and she doesn't have to find ways to get around the customs and the laws and the restrictions that are placed on women, and that become worse and worse and worse through most of her life, because she doesn't die until 1658, I think. And she's very outspoken, and she seems to think that eventually she's going to get everything back the way it was when in first century Rome. And she's articulate, and she gets exasperated easily, and she's a great character. I mean, all I've got to do is just sort of sit there and follow her on the page. She's wonderful that way. And but all the women that are involved are reflective of the times in which they live, and those few that go on to be vampires, very few of them do, are again in that position of comparing the lives they are living later on with the lives that they began many years before. And there are also a number of them who are, who become vampires, don't like it, and find ways to kill themselves, because adjusting is just too difficult and too demanding. And But yes, they are all books about women.
I would say that the vampire myth for women, why it's strong in the past and future and still, is that the vampire women were allowed a kind of a sexual expression of freedom that they didn't have because they swooned because the vampire came on them, if you know what I mean.
Well, that's the the idea of the swooning virgin is very much a 19th century literary artifact, and a lot of what you see from the time of the English Restoration on is, until you hit the Victorians, is this belief that women are, in fact, more sensual and more sexual than men, but they have to be controlled because they are so dangerous. And so creating a female character who is very, very comfortable with sexuality and not inclined to swoon just because she gets turned on is something that you find in literature before the 19th century, and then it starts creeping back in after.
So why do you think it's vampires are still popular today?
Well, it's the old death and sex thing. There seems to be an interesting tie in the psyche of human beings, which in many ways binds the idea of sexuality with the idea of dying. Now, that may be because, men lose erections after they ejaculate. That's the Freudian approach. It's also the idea that, all this is really wonderful, but it's all going to end. But however that works, you see it in a lot of the medieval romances, the idea that, the true lover, to prove that he's a true lover, has to die. And a woman who actually encourages the association also has to die because she is, causing him to be dead. When you start thinking about things like vampires, which are very, very enduring, and they've been in the culture for as long as they have, in all cultures, the presence of the vampire myth says something very profound about how human beings see themselves in relation to their psychological experience of life, which is different than the physical experience. And so long as we have that duality that equates sexuality and death, we're going to have vampires, we're going to have a whole bunch of other interesting creatures. My books, if you want to get them, you can get them through Amazon, you can get them through a lot of science fiction and fantasy and horror specialty stores like Dark Delicacies in Burbank. And as to there will be available some e-editions. There's e-editions of Hotel Transylvania and The Palace and Blood Games now at e-reads, and Tor will be making e-editions of almost everything they have in my backlist, and that's Tor.com. Do
you want to give your site out there for?
Oh yeah. Anyone, if you've got questions and you want to reach me, it's Chelsea Quinn Yarbro, all one word, .net.
Okay. Do you want to talk about Christopher Lee a little bit, or no? He's certainly involved with the vampires.
Oh yeah, and I dedicated Hotel Transylvania to Christopher Lee. And I have a lovely letter from him in my files about how much he enjoyed it.
So, what do you think of Christopher Lee?
I think he's a wonderful actor, and he's my favorite. He's still my favorite Dracula. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to have done it, and I hope that more women can appear and tell you their story as well.
And then we go and out. Okay. Introduce us to. This is Katie.
This is Ekaterina, the great empress of all the Russias. We call her Katie. But
Katie.
Just ask her. She is empress of all the Russias, and she is definitely an empress. So
these are your babies, huh?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cute.
She's. I particularly like the little white at the end of her tail.
Yeah, she had a nice thing. Katie, go back by your mommy, and you can be on camera. You want to go be on camera? Go sit back with your mommy, and she takes directions very well. All right, sit down now, Katie, and sit there next to mommy.
She probably won't.
Oh, she might. You never know.
You never. Yeah.
If you want to be seen, if you want a close-up shot, Katie, you have to turn this way.
Katie.
No, don't worry.
Katie.
Don't worry. So tell us about your animals now, if you will, since she's brought us to herself.
Well, there are 3 of them, and the other 2 are short hairs, and they're brother and sister. And it's Crumpet and Butterscotch. Butterscotch is the boy, and he's, of course, a red tabby, and Crumpet's a calico. And I've had them since they were 2 months old.
She's determined to. Okay.
Well, she says it has to be about her. I mean, after all, I got her from Maine Coon Rescue, and I have a friend who's a singer, and he and Katie, love to do scenes with each other. Is the only way I can describe it. He comes in and she flirts shamelessly with him, and he flirts right back, and she has a wonderful time.
So what Katie doesn't know is that I can edit and put shots of your book in between.
And there's on the Dragon Con site, there's a link to an homage that has all the covers of the Saint-Germain series.
No, you don't mind if I take?
No, that's Butterscotch.
She's not interested. How about you sitting by your fire? Is that nice?